Hi everyone, this is a review of your needs assessment critique paper, and hopefully you will listen to it before we meet again in class, so if you have questions we can go over them. As you can see, you will submit, if you're working alone, you will submit 2 documents, your paper and a reference list. If you're working as a group, one person will submit the reference list and the paper, and everyone will submit the group analysis form, which we'll look at later. Notice this says you will be writing in first person. This is first person because you're writing about your own experiences. You should not write in third person, except for one portion, which we'll talk about. And you definitely should not talk in second person, you, because that means you're telling me what to do. And that's very rare in this paper. So let's talk about it. There's a word limit. It's 5 double-spaced pages, 12-point font. If you use 11-point font, then you have fewer pages. Really, you should try to use 12-point font. Most people can write this in 3.5 to 5 pages. It depends on how you lay it out. If you go over 5 pages, you should probably run it by me to make sure you don't have too much information. If you're under 3.5 pages, you really need to make sure you've done what you were supposed to do. So this tells you these are the sections of your paper. Notice it says required. It doesn't say optional, which means these become the headings to your paper. So this is how I recommend you start your paper. The first thing I would tell you to do is to create your title page and then create a reference list. Even if it has nothing in it, just have those 2 sheets ready. You'll save the paper and you'll save the reference list as separate documents. The next thing you should do, if you want to get all the points for following directions, is to put in the required headings. So the first heading is introduction. And remember, it's an introduction of your paper. Of your paper doesn't go in the heading, but that's there to remind you. To have an introduction to your paper, you should have 1 or 2 statements about needs assessments, and then you should introduce the headings of your paper, which are listed. The next heading is the correct way to conduct a needs assessment, then how we conducted our needs assessment, critique of our needs assessment, and then again, summary is the heading, but make sure it's the summary of your paper. And a summary of your paper should look very similar to the introduction. If you think about the hamburger analogy that is sometimes used in Health 315, the hamburger bun, the top and bottom are both bread of some sort, but they're slightly different. They do the same thing, they're made of the same thing, but they're slightly different. But you should be making a statement or 2 about needs assessment and the headings of your paper. So, in this section, correct way to conduct a needs assessment, you need an expert. There are experts in our Blackboard page, there are experts in your textbooks, and there are experts from other material from other classes that you have had. Choose someone who knows how to conduct a needs assessment for health education. And then you're simply going to list the steps and explain them. So for example, you might have someone that says there are 8 steps to a needs assessment. You would then list them. I'm going to get this. And you will just continue. Step 1, what is it? Brief explanation. Step 2, what is it? Brief explanation. Or you might have a needs assessment that only has 5 steps. If your needs assessment from your expert has 5 steps, you list the step, explanation, list the step, explanation. So you can simply list and explain, or you can make it a narrative. It could actually be a narrative, and it would be 1 to 2 paragraphs. If it has 8 steps, it might be more than 2 paragraphs, but you want to try to be as succinct as possible. Then in this next section, you're going to do the same thing. How did you conduct your needs assessment? You could list it. You could put it in narrative. It also will probably be 1 to 2 paragraphs. Then the critique of the needs assessment, you are comparing your expert to what you did. Whichever expert you choose, you must use their entire process. If you have an expert that has 8 steps, you have to identify each of the 8 steps and if your group did it. If your expert has 5 steps, you have to identify all 5 steps and say if you did them. Sometimes people do this in a list. They'll have step 1 and then explain, did you do it? Or sometimes make it a narrative. Explain the steps and if they were done correctly. And the last way that I can think of that you would do this would be to insert a chart, a table, excuse me. And here you would say, what was the step that should have happened? And then what did happen? Oops, excuse me. So there's different ways you can do this critique. You can compare your expert by listing it, by doing it in narrative format, or by doing it in a chart. At the end of this section, you need to make a statement. Was your needs assessment done correctly? If not, what was missed? Almost no one has a perfect needs assessment, so almost all of you will be writing about what was not correct and how you would fix it in the future. If by chance it is perfect, then you would highlight key points on how to repeat that success. So that's how I think is the easiest way to set up your paper. If you do it this way, you're likely to get the most points. And then finally, the summary of your paper, which was already explained. So let's go back and look at the scoring rubric so you can see why I have that suggestion. So the first item is, did you follow all the directions? Is your paper set up correctly? Do you have the correct headings? Are you within a reasonable page limit? If you have 5.5 pages, I'm not taking off points. If you have 8, that's problematic. You have way too much information. Then 10 points. Have you been able to find an expert in the field and been able to identify the correct way that that expert says to conduct a needs assessment? If you're thorough, accurate, and succinct, you have a proper source and there's no major omissions or errors, that's worth 10 points. And you lose points based on missing things, based on what's here. The next section of your paper, describing your own needs assessment. Did you thoroughly, accurately, and succinctly describe what your group did? No omissions. I basically know what your groups are doing all semester, so if you miss something huge, I typically know it. If you talk about secondary data, you should cite it, and that should be on your reference list with a link where I can see the secondary data that you used. If you did primary data, that would be an attachment at the end of your paper so I could see the primary data that you're using. Then, did you do this? Did you do it correctly? Yes, we did it correctly. Why do you say that with supporting sources? And no, we did it, or you would say, no, we did it incorrectly and why, and explain how to fix it with supporting sources. This explains the points. This is the critical analysis piece of the paper, and as you notice, it's worth the most points. This is worth 50. So if you do not do the critical analysis piece, you drop to a C, 35 out of 50. If everything else is perfect, you receive a C. Here, did you use the correct font, spacing, margins? Do you have an intro, body, and summary that organizes the paper? Do you have the appendices that you need? And do you have the APA format and reference list? I'll be taking that out. Your appendices will just go at the end of the paper. And spelling and grammar. If you have up to 2 errors in a 5-page paper, you get 6 points, but you lose 1 point for each error over 2. So if you only do the blue sections, 13, 20, 25, 35, that's a C. If those sections are done perfectly, it's a C. There's no critical thinking. To get a B or an A, you have to do all of that and do this really critical analysis of what you've done. So let's review. Your first submission is your paper with a title page and appropriate appendices. The second document is a reference list, minimum of 1 reference, probably no more than 3 references. So let's look at this other document. If you work in a group of 2 or 3, one person submits the paper and the reference list. Everyone submits this document. So it tells you to list your name and your partner's names or name, and then you fill this out. So notice you have to give yourself a letter grade, and you have to give your people a letter grade and an explanation of why that letter's there. So here are the main parts of the paper: correct way to conduct, what you did, and was it done correctly. So if there are 3 of you, each one of you should probably do those parts. However, you must share your work with each other. So if somebody chooses expert A on how to conduct a needs assessment, this person did you do it correctly? They need both of these sections of the paper in order to write that 3rd section. So that's up to you. Sometimes someone volunteers to do the intro and summary of the paper, and other people do all this hard work. That's not acceptable, and this person will receive a lower grade. So everybody has to do some type of equitable work. Sometimes one person will do the intro and summary, one person will do correct way, one person will do the way you did it, and then as a group you sit and discuss, well, did we do it correctly based on what we've done? Remember, there has to be one person in charge of each row, and you can say Susie Q was in charge of the way we conducted our needs assessment, and it was proved by person X or person X and Y. Again, if you're working in a group, it takes a lot of effort. This explains what will happen if the work is different among your group members. And the other thing that I don't see here that's really important is if you work in a group, you have to really assign people jobs, and you need a deadline that is before the due date of the paper so that you can put the paper together and make sure it reads as if one person wrote it. Please make sure this is clear on everything. We've gone over how to do it with a group. We've gone over, let me open the other documents. We've gone over the scoring rubric, and we've gone over a suggestion on how to set up your paper so that you get the most points possible. I look forward to seeing you in class. You can either wait to ask questions about this in class, or you can send me emails, and I'm happy to answer them as we go. I look forward to seeing you and reading all of your work. Have a great week, everyone.